Yeah, welcome everyone. Cheers again for coming along to this is the season finale of the Nelson Reimagined Interdisciplinary Talk series. So yeah, we've got people that are in the room here and also sort of people that are joining us online. The idea of the talks is to sort of bring together some people that can sort of provoke or prompt some questioning around kind of what's happening to do with the Town Deal programme, and particularly within the sort of This Is Nelson strand, which we'll talk a bit more about it. Today we're joined by Keir Milburn, who's coming across from Leeds, and Sue Knight from. Do you live in Clarion House? No, you live in Barrowford. Not too bad. Managed to cycle across. So yeah, I'll just kind of run through the schedule today. So yeah, we'll do a quick sort of bit of intros about where the talk series has come from, and Corenza's going to talk a little bit about the This Is Nelson programme as well. And we'll have 15 minutes from Sue about Clarion House and Unity Hall and the sort of independent Red Nelson, the kind of history of Nelson. And then we've got Keir, who's going to sort of present some case studies and also talk about some of his ideas around public-common partnerships, which I think are sort of quite interesting in building on what we've already been discussing in the last couple of talks. And yeah, hopefully we'll get by 7:30 into a bit of sort of Q&A, and we can a bit of discussion here. Obviously, those people that are online are more than welcome to put questions through the chat, which Callum is fielding, or we might even be able to sort of bring you up on our screen. And then we'll just do a little sort of goodbye at the end as well and tell you about some of the things that are coming up. So yeah, just so you know, the Nelson Reimagined strand is kind of a sub-strand within the This Is Nelson strand within the overall Town Deal programme. But really the idea is to have a sort of future orientated or a future looking sort of strand within this kind of investment that's coming in. So really thinking about kind of, yeah, what's the sort of afterlife or kind of the sustainable future that this investment could sort of build in a place like Nelson. And I think when we're sort of thinking about the titles for it, reimagined is a word that gets knocked about quite a lot at the moment, but I think it's also a useful thing because it's about working with what's already there. So you're not just kind of imagining something out of thin air, you're kind of thinking, okay, well, what's here and how do we sort of imagine that differently? So this reimagined sort of word seems to be fitting for that. And as much as we're sort of looking at the future, in order to do that, we've got to sort of look back through the kind of lens of the past and the present as well to be able to sort of do that building. And a sort of another key, I guess, concept or kind of something that's been coming up a lot within what we're doing is this idea of kind of thinking globally and acting locally. So kind of thinking about Nelson not just as a sort of isolated little sort of town that doesn't relate to other places. There's lots of places that are kind of in a similar sort of boat as Nelson, and without kind of overlooking the kind of essential character of the place, how do we kind of make those kind of international connections as well, or think about these things globally whilst, yeah, sort of doing the work that's here. So, I mean, most of the people that are here are obviously preaching to the converted, but there might be a couple of people on there that haven't been to Nelson or don't know it, but we're recording these as well. But yeah, as you know, Nelson's a sort of post-industrial town, was built on a specific sort of form of industry, the textiles industry, and kind of that is no longer present. So kind of a lot of the post-industrial towns that I've worked in previously and lived in and sort of enjoyed being in, I feel like, well, you've got this sort of sense of identity, a collective sense of identity of a place based around work. And once that form of work's gone, then you kind of can be in this sort of free-falling position. It's kind of interesting to know, well, where, you know, what happens when those kind of places land differently, or kind of what's their next sort of phase. I feel like sort of, yeah, Nelson, along with lots of other post-industrial places, are in this sort of state of flux. But kind of within that kind of fragile moment, there's all this great potential for things that have sort of either played with or done differently, or tactics that have been born out of kind of need for resilience or kind of a different way of doing things. And kind of really what Nelson Reimagined about as a strand is kind of mapping and trying to find out what those roots and seeds of a different sort of future might be. So one of the kind of words or phrases that's getting used a lot around kind of the post-industrial north is this idea of, you know, the left behind towns, and the kind of, oh, well, these places need to somehow catch up with their kind of more successful economic brothers and sisters. You've always got like Newcastle and Sunderland, Leeds and Bradford, kind of Sheffield, Rotherham, kind of, and it's like, well, how do we get these other places to catch up? But I often think, well, one of the reasons for this programme is to think, well, can we think about that differently and think about sort of beyond just levelling up and catching up, and actually what's kind of here that would sort of put us in this state of being more at the avant-garde of something new, something different, because a lot of these places used to be that and kind of put that in the history. So this kind of concept of the bleeding edge, I think, is sort of taken from technology talk, but it's kind of like, yeah, actually being at the kind of forefront of things is sometimes actually a really uncomfortable and difficult place to be. It's kind of like it's not necessarily doing the cutting. Sometimes the cutting is getting done to it. So yeah, so we're thinking about, what's the kind of way of thinking about a place like Nelson, or Nelson specifically, as kind of forging a new path and a new sort of sustainable path that other places that are all experiencing crisis could be looking somewhere like Nelson for, well, you've dealt with these things in the past and you've kind of come through it, and what is there to learn from here? So that's the kind of the way in which we're doing that, is through a sort of programme of artist research. So this year we commissioned four artists to sort of undertake the first stage of this R&D, and that's building on a lot of work that both In-Situ and kind of Building Bridges and lots of other organisations have done in the past, sort of getting to know embedded approach to the area. Try and generate new sort of fields of inquiry, or sort of take an action research approach to kind of how do we unearth what's here, what's already in Nelson, where can we sort of like identify some of the seeds that we could be building on or investing in through this town deal money. The kind of method, I suppose, with these, we've just come into the end of the first year now. We're going to have an artist sharing at the end of the month, but the idea, I suppose, is that each time an artist comes in, they're not necessarily just kind of painting a picture of the thing that has happened, and kind of that's what you get. It's like they're generating new fields of inquiry and new questions that we can sort of build on. So the method really is this sort of like a virtuous circle of action research. So we'll kind of talk a little bit more about what the artists that we've been working with this year have kind of come up with, but how we might sort of build on that next year. And another kind of method, I suppose, that I'm kind of interested in at the moment, or sort of pulling, is this idea of low intervention regeneration, which is a term that I've borrowed from the world of natural wine, which I'm spending a lot of time doing my research in, but this idea of kind of working with a place, not to kind of force it to become a certain type or to produce a certain type of culture, but sort of to think, well, what's the culture of that place and how do you sort of embrace that? And sort of it might require a bit of kind of understanding of, I don't know, something that's a bit unfiltered or difficult to digest or a bit weird, but kind of how do we kind of create that sort of approach and then put that into thinking about regeneration in general. So again, retaining the character of somewhere like Nelson, so not reimagining it and kind of building over it, but kind of thinking, well, what's there and how do you sort of progress it, and how can Nelson be a town of the post-capitalist future? So as I mentioned, we've commissioned sort of 4 artists this year to undertake some micro research. That's been Michael Powell, who's been looking at the underused spaces of the commons in kind of in the town centre. Dana Olarescu, who's been looking mostly at sort of food systems and kind of food and growing and knowledge around food and growing, particularly from sort of new arrivals and migrant communities in Nelson. Christina Borg, who's been looking at the blue and green spaces, which has been the sort of canal and the parks, and been doing really interesting foraging walks and kind of being guided around by people of Nelson. Samantha Jones, who's been sort of tasked with something I guess we're going to talk a bit more about today, but which is kind of the potential for cooperative or alternative models of governance and kind of different ways of kind of organising. And then myself, I've been sort of working along along with the research project we've been doing for a while about the future of work, mostly working with young people and thinking about, well, what does the future of work look like in places like Nelson, using gaming and VR to do that. So if you're around this weekend, you'll be able to come on Saturday and Sunday and sort of experience some of the kind of the traces of this kind of inquiry, or this first stage of research and action research that the artists have been working on. I won't go through the entire programme there, but Michael's going to be giving a sort of walk around the town centre to look at those underused spaces. Samantha's going to do a sort of alternative town planning session at the library. I'll be offering a future of work video game making session, which I think Ozzy's done that's already in here, but everyone's invited. And yeah, Christine's doing a foraging walk, and Anna's having an experimental food festival, feast at the end of something to sort of round off the event, but we'll then have we'll meet back here and have a sort of panel discussion with the artists as well. So yeah, that's what's coming up quite soon. Just to mention, yeah, so alongside that sort of action research, this series of talks, we've had sort of 3, as I mentioned, this third, but the idea has been to bring in practitioners, not necessarily artists, but people that kind of work and research in this sort of area about either sort of post-industrial towns or community economies, or sort of help places sort of reimagine what they are. So we've had Catherine Byrne, who works, well, she's an artist, but does a lot of work with community economics, and sort of presented about her project Company Drinks, which kind of reinvigorated this old tradition of gleaning and using kind of forgotten and discarded sort of ways to make a drinks company in a sort of social way. We've had Owen Griffiths, who does lots of really interesting work in Swansea, and we're sort of talking again mostly about sort of like growing and kind of food growing projects, and using sort of food as a way of kind of engaging communities into rethinking where they are, reimagining what they're doing. And with these talks, whilst we're inviting people in, we're always thinking, well, how do we kind of ground some of that kind of interesting sort of thinking and provocations and ambitious thinking that they're bringing with the local experts. So yeah, as I say, we've got Sunak today, but we've also had Arif from the Friendship Cafe, and of course, well, Lorenzo and Paul from In-Situ as well, because they know the place very well. So really what we're hoping to get out of these is a series of kind of prompts or questions or things that we can take forward and sort of apply. So that doesn't all have to happen tonight. It's kind of something that we'll sort of work with afterwards. Previously, some of the things that have come out when we talked to Catherine has been sort of, well, what and where are the common and shared assets in Nelson? How can we ensure that we set up structures that outlive the Nelson Town Deal programme? What would a sustainable food plan for Nelson look like? That was kind of Owen's like very direct application. So kind of keep in mind some questions, and these are things that we hope to sort of digest and continue to work with either in a sort of session next week or kind of like later in the program. So yeah, as I say, we're very lucky to be joined by Keir today, who I've had a pleasure working with a bit, and Sue as well, who's, well, I've met through going up to Client House, and I'll introduce properly just after Corinne does a bit of background on This Is Nelson, and you can just press the arrows to work through that.
Thanks very much, Andy. I will keep it brief. So This Is Nelson, as stated before, is a strand being funded through the town deal that Nelson were able to secure. They secured £25 million till 2026. And there's just a quick overview of what we're delivering. So £25 million towards the town, of which we've been able to secure about £1 million of that towards an arts and cultural programme. And I work with In-Situ, and our role really within this project is obviously as an arts organisation, but we also work closely with Building Bridges, who are partners within that. And Building Bridges are a community development agency working across Pendle. We are looking to achieve the programme through creative commissions, community engagement events, and reactivation of places and spaces. The programme is working across 5 strands of work. So we've talked about the artist-led and Nelson Reimagined, but also the other strands we'll be looking at as heritage, working with young people, neighbourhoods, and obviously town centre partnerships and interventions. So quite a standard, I suppose, in some ways, art and regeneration programme. But as Andy mentioned before, and what's really important about this artist-led strand is that it's through artists and research, we're feeding in the information and the columnists, as it were, that the artists are doing with our communities, working closely with our other kind of agencies in the town, like Building Bridges, but also Super Slowway. Again, we're trying to connect up with existing programmes of work. So whatever we're doing feels like a partnership, a collaboration. And obviously, with the funds, as generous as it might seem, over 3.5 years, it doesn't really go hugely. So another way of maximising that is collaborative practice and collaborative commissioning. So we've obviously been going, as Andy mentioned, our programme was 3.5 years, so we've sort of done the first half, and we've been really focusing on research and obviously working with artists, spending time in the neighbourhood, speaking to people. So we've done a variety of different activities. These are just mood board type images, which are coming through. And just to sort of, and then, so obviously I've mentioned before about the heritage strand, obviously Nelson sort of rooted in a strong, there we go, historical context. So we're doing some R&D with a photographer, Chris Eastman, and he and his collaborator, Arif, we're looking at the pioneer communities that are coming, that had first arrived in Nelson in the 1960s. We're focusing around that time in the 1960s in Nelson because it was a really interesting time in the sense that a lot of the immigrant communities were arriving. Nelson went through a big phase of regeneration in its own right. The Pendle Rise, as it is called now, the big shopping centre arrived, and everybody was excited, and it just felt like the heralding of a brand new world. Looking now back at the kind of arc, the narrative arc, it was sort of like the beginning of the end in many ways. So now where we are now is the Pendle Rise, potentially, hopefully quite soon, will be pulled down. We can, and Nelson sort of reimagined, hopefully, properly, reorganised. So it's an interesting time between the 1960s to where we are today. But underlining all of that, underpinning that, really were the influx of new communities, like particularly from Pakistan, coming over, and we're interested in exploring that story and exploring how they navigated where to eat, where to pray, how, everything, I'd imagine, school. So it's really an interesting way of drawing on the heritage, and obviously we're going to be looking at the heritage tonight as well of Nelson. This is some of the work that Craig has done previously with us, with our shopkeepers, our shopkeeper here just next door. And obviously young people is an important part of what we do, that In-Situ do anyway. We have a strong history of working with young people. Ozzy in our audience is a prime example of how we can put them up for the bootstraps and keep them with us. And then also the work that Andy mentioned previously with the future work has we've developed a relationship with the local college, and that piece of work is going from strength to strength. So those are our highlights at the moment. Something's not coming through. There's some images here of the future of work. So I'm just going to leave it there because then we can crack on this tonight.
Okay, thanks, So I'm just going to get your slideshow sorted out, because yours is going to sort of play in the background, isn't it? I think we've got a slightly jittery internet connection today, but we'll be all right. I can, yeah. Okay, perfect. Thanks very much, Callum. Sorry about the technical difficulty. So yeah, we'll resume with Sue Dyke from the Clarion House.
So, thank you. Thanks for asking me. Now, I'm not an intellectual. I'm not an academic. I'm just an ordinary working class woman. Left school at 15. Couldn't stand all the rules. Needed to get out and earn some money, go to work, to enjoy myself. But once I'd moved and had all my children, I went back to Nelson College and did the Open College course just to prove I wasn't stupid. So I know I'm not stupid, but I'm really interested in local history, and I love this area so much. And I think local history is so important for the young people who live here now to know about where this place came from. I'm just going to quote 3 little phrases. Socialism, our hope, which is on Unity Halls, carved in stone at the top of Unity Hall. on the banner we've got the clarion, fellowship is life. And another big banner we've got is workers of the world unite. And these are all aspirations or demands or whatever you'd like to call them, but they're really important foundations that the people who used to run this town and who set up all these established organisations, ran municipal socialism. They actually implemented it. They actually had a vision, and the vision was that working class people deserved a better future than they were being promised. They deserved better conditions, they deserved a bit of culture, they deserved to be part of a community. And because of the establishment of the cotton trade in this area, most of the mills were weaving mills, and most of the workers were women. But they were dedicated not just to what they were doing at work, they were dedicated to the betterment of the people they worked with. And at that time, factories and mills, hundreds and hundreds of people worked, and they worked together and they collaborated, and they had a better way of establishing what they really wanted to happen in their area because they did it collectively and they worked together. Now, these people came into Nelson. My grandparents came into Nelson and Colne from Elland in Yorkshire, my great-grandmother, my great-granddad from Ireland. My granddad was born on Windy Bank in Colne. My dad was born on Dover Street, just about 6 streets away from here. And we have a very large extended family. And we'd get together, and this is what happened in lots of families, working class families. We'd get together at separate occasions. Everybody would have to sing, everybody would have to do something, but we did it collectively, and it was an established collective thing that people did because they were all together and they had a common vision. The vision that the people who set up the Nelson establishment came from people coming into this area, because Nelson wasn't Nelson, it was Little Marsden. There were about 4,000 people lived here, and that population increased and increased till there were over 20,000 people living and working in the mills and the foundries and factories in this area. And the housing that was built around this area, all the terraced housing, was built for those workers, including my grandma and granddad and a lot of my relatives. But the Nelson houses were of much better quality than Burnley's because they were built with bigger backyards, they were built with probably long-drop toilets, but they were built in a much better quality because they were built for a new town. This was a new town. And whilst you mentioned earlier about people coming in the 1960s to work in the mills, my auntie and uncle worked at Smith & Nephews. I used to go in and see when they were working. The noise was tremendous, but they worked with a lot of Asian heritage people who'd come here, just like my grandparents and great-parents had done when they came here, when it was set up as a new town. Right, so we go back now to the building on Vernon Street. Let's start there. The Independent Labour Party was formed in Nelson before it was formed nationally. They were so far ahead of the rest of the country. They decided they needed a building. They built a building on Vernon Street. It's an absolutely fantastic building, and if you can go into it now, it's a warm hub now, which is great. It's a warm hub for this little area. But that's where they did a lot of their meetings. They had plays, they had music, they had art, they had culture. People that don't think that working class people can do this sort of thing, but they did, and that was their work was their main, obviously their income, obviously. But particularly for the women who were having children, running homes, working in the mill, then going out to political meetings at night, and brings me on to my hero, my heroine, who is Selina Cooper, who was a foundation stone layer of the ILP building on Vernon Street. Fantastic woman, fought for the votes, for for women. She was part of the suffrage movement. She collected money around the mills and the factories to set up first mother and baby clinics. Nelson was far beyond the rest of the country. They had municipal housing, they had their own gas, their own electric, they had a municipal socialism. That's what they had, and it was just so thriving. The place was thriving, but people still had very poor conditions to work in. There was a lot of strife. Selina was part of that. I became really interested in local history. I was in the library one day. I had 4 children, I was a foster parent, but I was still really wanted to know about my local history. I was looking through an old book there, wartime people from the First World War. Sergeant John Carroll, that's my granddad. What's he doing in it? He was injured in Gallipoli. Where's Gallipoli? What's the stonemason from Colne doing in Gallipoli? Wanted to know more about it. Started to investigate where I come from. Discovered Selina Cooper. Discovered other women who'd fought for the rights, for the vote for women, and wanted to be part of this thing. I got onto Pendle Council. Yeah. Became a councillor. Eventually was a leader of the council for a while. And I was really interested, and I could never understand why the council didn't sell the heritage of this area as part of one of our benefits. And I think that's a future that we can look at. We can look at the future people coming here for all sorts of different reasons, to look at the heritage that we and those people created. Now, I knew a lot of these old people. They told me all about this, but obviously I read about it, a lot about it. But when we got to the 50th anniversary of Selina Cooper's death, a group of women got together and we formed a committee, and we set up, we had a week's worth of celebrations, because this woman, Selina Cooper, Jill Liddington wrote a book all about her, The Life and Times of a Respectable Rebel, and it's the most fantastic bit of local history you could read. If you've not read it, and get hold of a copy, it's such an eye-opener. The struggles that they went through was unbelievable. But there they are on Nelson Railway Station, going off to lobby for peace. We've all been doing that for years, haven't we? But they started it. So that was an inspiration to me. So Jill Liddington came and actually spoke. We put a blue plaque on the house where she lived. Selina lived on St Mary's Street. We knocked on the door to ask who was it. It's me, Uncle George. I didn't know that. And there, Uncle George, we want to put a plaque on this house. Is it okay? Yes. I went back a few years ago just to see if the blue plaque was still there. And the woman who came to the door, Bush for her name, and she was pregnant. And I said, is it okay for us to leave this plaque on? She said, you can leave it there forever. She says, I'm expecting a baby. She said, and my midwife came, and she looked at that plaque and she said, what a woman, Selina Cooper. So you see, that has passed through to another generation of a different heritage, but she knew about this woman. It was amazing. So anyway, all these people who ran the ILP at Nelson decided that working class people needed to get out into the countryside. They needed to cycle and walk, and this is what they did. They bought a field. They borrowed £350 from the Weavers Union. Still over there, the Weavers Union, Silverman Hall. If you look up, it's got Weavers Institute on the top of it. Another bit of history. And they built this building in 1912, and we still run it, and it's still going strong. Now, I'm going to run out of time, but I want to just briefly tell you about a group of young girls who came over to the Clarion. We run all sorts of things over there. People come and talk, and we have talks and choirs and all sorts of things. But a group of young girls came over from the Burnley youth group. 2 youth leaders decided these young girls, such low aspirations, didn't like school, couldn't be bothered, but they wanted them to know about their history. She brought them over to the Clarion, and I talked to them about them. There was 11 to 15, these girls, on the phone. So right, phone's off now. I said, how old are you? 11. I told them all about Selena and her background, all about the struggles she had to get to where they are now. 11, right, okay, you'd be 11, right. You'd be going to school in the morning, but in the afternoon you'd be working in the mill, or the other way around, whichever. Said, and when you got your money, you wouldn't get much, a few pennies, you'd have to give it to your mother. Oh, how old are you? 15. Oh, you'd be working full time. No chance of anything else for you. No phone, something. Those girls went to look at a mill in Burnley that was still working. They went to various other things. But those youth workers inspired them, and the story about Selena inspired them. They went away and they created all these banners about various things. That's one's about Selena, that's about cooperation and fellowship, that's about stand tall, that's about have your say. They made all these banners and they were put up in the Mechanics Institute in Burnley, and then they had at the end of this project, the girls all came onto the stage and they all presented, and you wouldn't think they were the same lasses, really. You wouldn't think they were the same unconfident, uninspired young people that got up on that stage and told us all what they were now doing, what they wanted to do, what they've been inspired to do, just by talking about their history that they didn't know nothing about. And to me, apart from the local heritage and the interest that this area should show to people in this whole country, that is a way forward. Inspire young people to think about what went before and what they can do in the future. And they then believed that they could do anything. It was fantastic to see that that came out of just one little talk and one little group. Two inspired workers at Burnley who were running a youth centre. So we need to build on what we already got. Pendle Landscape Partnership was another inspiration. I was on the board of that, and we formed, one of the projects was the Pendle Radicals group. In-Situ were involved in that fantastically. Every element of it had an art, every element on that project had an artistic input from somewhere, or mostly from In-Situ. And it was a brilliant project, but it showed what radical people there were in this local area. George Fox up on Pendle Hill, the independent Methodists who refused to be part of the whole system, Clarion House, and other people like that chap who didn't invent Greenwich Mean Time, but he triggered the interest in making sure that ships that were sailing all went at the same timeline. But he lived in Fence, and people don't know anything about this. We've got so much history, it's amazing. Diane's dad used to come over to the Clarion, one of the major rambling groups, walkers. He was there every Sunday.
Broke his arm if he couldn't get there.
Absolutely it did. And he was such a lovely, interesting man. And he always, everybody who used to come up were doing things for the benefit of others. And to me, that's what we need to be focusing on. This is for not for us, not for me, not for you. It's for the benefit of all of us together. So I think that Nelson has got a lot to offer. People shouldn't run it down. Oh, Nelson, oh, it's rubbish. It's not like it used to be. But it's got so much potential, and the people are what made it in the first place. And the people who are there now can continue to make it thrive, I think. So I think thank you for this opportunity to speak about Nelson. I'm passionate about it. My children think I'm bonkers, but they are my future too. And one of my granddaughters just had her second baby, so I'm a Gigi. I've got two great grandchildren as well. And I love them to bits, but they're part of this local community. They all live locally, they all take part. And we should all take part in our local community, shouldn't we? We should be part of a group, not just of a family group, but part of a wider community. So I think this project It's got a lot going for it. I think it needs to be artistically led, and I think our future is in our heritage and our young people and in culture in general. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, that's that. So yeah, thanks again, Sue, and like I say, quite keen for us to get into a position where we can start sort of grounding and sort of talking a bit about some of those things that you brought up there to do with the kind of the history and the importance of history of kind of collectivism here. So Keir, I've known for quite a while through Leeds as being a sort of academic and an activist and a researcher, or sort of looking at, I guess, the commons and the idea of the commons, and kind of I thought it'd be brilliant for him to be able to come in and sort of talk to us a little bit about some of this work he's been doing with Commonwealth and Abundance, looking at about how do you build on and kind of, I guess, embrace and activate some of that heritage and the kind of and the people power that can be in a place like Nelson as well. So I'll pass over to Keir now. Passport did you right to the end? Sorry, Keir.
Now you've revealed all my secrets. Yeah, thanks for the invite to come and talk. And thanks for that talk, Sue. It was basically the perfect setup for me. Because, well, in fact, it's a really good setup because some of the, I'm going to get a little bit abstract in a moment, but you know what we're proposing, what the work I'm doing with my friends and colleagues, in loads of ways, it is actually just in reinventing what was in existence, you know, probably in the pre-war years, we probably say. When, you know, the working class movement, in fact, it had all sorts of projects around all areas of life, like the Clarion, the cycling club and the walking clubs, and self-education, the plebs leagues, all of these things where people would attend to their needs, basically, in a collective way, which is what I think we need to do now. Strangely enough, that just at the beginning of this year, I went to a big sort of conference in Bradford at Manningham Mills, and because Sue was saying that the ILP was formed locally, actually just up the road, and the conference was to celebrate the anniversary of the founding of the ILP nationally, which happened at Manningham Mills.
Just a year after.
Yeah. And that had followed on from a big strike that had gone on at Manningham. I think 2 years before, something like that, which had really energized the local area, basically. And this big conference, what we did was everyone was sat around a table. They were given a table. We all sat around, and strangely, there was someone there from the Clarion Cycling Club called Mike, who was part of our group that we were talking to. Just a nice little connection, I think. Yeah, I'm going to talk about this idea of public common partnerships. I'll explain what that means in a moment. It's something I've been working on for the last sort of 5 years, and then just recently there's a big group of us, well, there's 8 of us, who are setting up an organization to try to develop these sorts of projects, basically, in various places. We're going to be called Abundance. I've got the website address there. Please don't go on it. It's not actually live. We haven't launched yet. But you never know, somebody might be watching this in a few months' time when they're able to click on that. What I want to do on this is that I'll just sort of talk through, I'm going to start off by talking through why we think like community ownership and like common governance of buildings, of perhaps production, you know, one of the projects we'll talk about a little bit later is pharmaceuticals and factories run as a common, which is a project we're trying to develop in France. All sorts of things basically owned in common and governed in common. I want to say why we think that's probably important, and we're going to set up, you know, the sort of problems, the way we see the world in our organisation, and the way we see community ownership addressing those sort of problems, and sort of talk through that a little bit, and then I'll talk a little bit more abstractly about what is this thing, public common partnership. Sounds a bit dry, probably is a bit dry, but of course, when you put that into practice, it becomes very undry. So then I'll talk through either 3 or 4 different cases that we're working on at the moment. One of them is a market in Tottenham in North London. Another one is a project to establish a network of commonly owned and governed aqua farms on the Isle of Skye up in Scotland. So a completely different community to Tottenham. One of the development trusts we're working with up there is on the Isle of Raasay, which is an island off the Isle of Skye. The whole population of that island is only 300 people. But yet they've got a lot of commonly owned and governed infrastructure there already. Why? Because nobody else is going to do it for them. I think that's probably a connection to somewhere like Nelson, to be honest. And so these communities, which seem very, very different, have actually got some of the same problems to address. And I'll talk a little bit, I think, about this project, which is quite interesting in France. It's a project to try to establish a network of pharmaceutical factories making medicines, but run commonly, owned commonly, run commonly. And what that allows you to do, basically, is sort of quite far away from what our concerns here. But it's a way of sort of thinking, well, these sorts of things could actually encompass quite a large part of the economy. And like part of what we think is important is that more and more of economic relations need to be brought into these sorts of like commonly owned and governed sorts of setups. And if I've got time, I might talk about a project in Bradford, actually, which might be interesting for us. But let's see if we've got time. Perhaps we'll talk about that in the questions. I'm not sure. But before we get to that, I want to sort of set up. Like, there's loads of ways we could start this conversation. But I wanted to start because somebody mentioned earlier about, like, thinking globally and then acting locally. And this is a way to do that. This is this thing here, this circle. It's called the donut. People talk about the donut, and I talk about donut economics. It's a way of sort of thinking about well, the way we're going to do it is going to set up and say, look, the really big problem facing us as a society, as a species, is there's a big gap between what's necessary and what's possible to do, right? That is the problem. Obviously, the big spur of that problem of why there's a gap between what is necessary to do or where it's necessary to get to and our inability to get there is climate change, right? So this idea, this donut is one way of setting up that. So trying to think this through. It's quite a well-used image, this at the minute, and it's a donut because the thing on the outside. On that is called the ecological ceiling. People talk about as natural boundaries as well. And the thing on the inside, they talk about that as social boundaries or the social foundation. The outside ring, that comes from a whole series of studies that this group of scientists did. This guy, Johan Rockstrom, etc. They collected up all of the best scientific evidence on what they call Earth system processes. So this is things such as the carbon carrying capacity of the atmosphere, climate change. There's other stuff on there, making the oceans becoming more acidificate, and that's also to do with climate change, because what happens is that the oceans absorb carbon, and that makes it more acidic, which means it's more and more difficult for life to survive there. All sorts of stuff. And basically what they did is they collected up all of the best scientific evidence of these 9 Earth system processes upon which basically human civilization depends. And they say, well, each one of those has got a what they call a tipping point, which if you go beyond it, it's very hard to come back. And they say, look, they said, we can't go beyond these boundaries. And in fact, we don't know exactly where these boundaries are. So we have to add a precautionary principle and basically keep away from those boundaries. So their argument is this: you can have any form of society, any form of economics, any form of like technology you want, right? As long as it doesn't breach those outer, those tipping points. Because if you do, you're into a new situation in which human civilization has never experienced before, and we're very close to reaching those in terms of climate change already, right? Somebody called Kate Raworth, who used to work for Oxfam, she's an economist who works for Oxfam. She added this in a bit of the donut they call social foundations, and that is what people need. That the things people need in order to be able to, live a fulfilled life and participate in society. And she draws them from the UN Human Rights Convention, and she says, look, these are things that people would all agree on. There are all sorts of stuff, enough food, access to clean water, access to health, education, She has things like political voice, the ability, you know, a way to talk about democracy, something like that, you'd probably say. And she says that it's not just enough to keep within that outer ring. You need to have, the reason we want to keep within that outer ring, well, there might be all sorts of reasons, but one of them is so that we can have, like, you know, fulfilling life for everybody on the planet, basically. So she says, you need a safe and just operating space for humanity. We need to get our... So that, in a way, I think sets up where we need to be. We need to be within those things. Unfortunately, we're exceeding, or it looks as though we could be close to exceeding a lot of the natural boundaries, and we are dropping below the social boundaries or the social foundations. And so there's this argument you could make this, which is that's the necessary. We need to get there. That's what like a just transition. People talk about that quite a lot. You know, we need to move somewhere which is you know, which has got a different energy base where we're not pumping out all of this carbon, etc. But we also need to move to a place where, you know, everybody has access to the things that they need. The problem is, we're not going there. There's a gap between what seems socially, politically possible to do at the moment and what is necessary to do. There's a gap. That you create these sorts of things so that you can say, right, we need to get there. Let's backcast from there and say, all right, what are the stages that we need to do in order to get to where we need to be? Then you can forecast from where we are now and say, well, what is it possible to do now under our present, you know, political setup, etc., etc. But there's a gap, basically. It doesn't seem possible to bridge it. And our point is, you know, what does that suggest? Well, the natural boundaries aren't movable. I'm sorry to say, you know, the carbon carrying capacity of the atmosphere, it doesn't matter whether you believe in it or not, that's just there waiting. It's a bit like the boiling point of water. Doesn't matter if you believe in it or not, you add enough energy to water, it turns into a gas. Do you know what I mean? Of course, what seems socially and politically possible to do is something that can change. And it can change because you can organize things in a different way. For us, we think that like, one of the key mechanisms for changing what seems socially and politically possible is by creating new political agents in a way. You could put it that way, you can use that language, or as we put it here, you know, like by building active, organized and resourced communities, right, is the way in which you alter things, right? Because if you build active, organized and resourced communities, they can assert their interests, basically, right? And we also think there's another part to that argument, which is we think that like that by having commonly owned and like basically getting assets and resources and infrastructure, so buildings, perhaps the infrastructure that we depend on, you know, by governing them in common, by owning them and governing them in common, that's sort of like those are like perhaps they're the seeds around which active and organized communities can be built, right? Something like that. Well, let's start off with that. So for us, that was a bit of a lag. For us, that was sort of like, that's our idea of like, well, look, this is the problem we need to address. And this is why we think this sort of work is really, really important, basically. And so then we sort of like, you know, it's about 5 years ago, me and a friend, Bertie Russell, we were thinking through some of the problems of like, well, what needs to happen in that case is that you can't just have like these workers co-ops as nice things that just exist a bit on the periphery, you know what I mean? Or perhaps, you know, perhaps you'll have a community pub in one area, and it's a nice thing to have, and it's very valuable for that community, but it's not spreading around the world and, you know, creating new possibilities, basically, in order to address something which is a world problem, really, really big problem. So we started playing around with this idea of public common partnerships. And when we first started talking about that, we had a very specific thing in mind. We were using this idea of public-private partnerships as a help us think through what this word might mean, with the idea that we would want to reverse engineer this idea of public-private partnership. So public-private partnerships, the most famous version of that in the UK is called private finance initiatives, PFIs, which you may have heard of because they were really, really big, particularly in the new Labour era, for building new schools, for building hospitals, for doing all sorts of infrastructure work, for doing like public services, these sorts of things, basically. I don't, or you can see that, but there were a lot of frowns and thumb down because they've definitely fallen out of favour, and there's been quite a few scandals around PFIs for all sorts of reasons. Partly because, as the finances work out, they on average they cost the state 30% more than just the state like doing it directly, basically. The reason they were popular because it was an accounting scam, because it would keep it off the books. It didn't really matter to that degree. But we wanted to think about, well, what is going on with these? Why were they introducing them, and what is going on with these public-private partnerships? And like when you get into it, what it means is that the state will, like in a private finance initiative, the state will give the initial money, right? And then or it will fund. The private sector will give the initial money, but they will have a guaranteed like contract for 30 years. And so that would be paid off over 30 years, this hospital or whatever, and it will cost the state so much more. So what that really means is that people talk about it in different ways, but what it is that the public is de-risking or underwriting private enterprise. So there's no risk at all for the private enterprise who's building and running this hospital or running this building and doing the repairs on this school. There's no risk at all for them because the state's taken on all the risk. And that's what a public-private partnership is. The public takes on all the risks for it, and the private gets all the gains for it, right? So we were saying, hang on a minute, well, couldn't you do it like where the public de-risks the common? So there's a partnership between the public sector and common ownership projects, where the public actually, they're the ones who sort of like underwrite the loans perhaps, or they basically make possible the spread of these commonly owned projects, our sort of idea. As we were going through it a bit, we thought, well, you know, as we start to set some of these projects up or work on some of these projects, we came across this other problem that we thought, well, actually, we started off with this problem. We thought, no, actually, this is the really, really big problem, right? Well, because when we go back to climate change again, one of the big problems with like why climate change doesn't get addressed is because of the decisions that are made about what gets built, right? So it's all about like who controls investment decisions about how investments are made, or the sort of like the things that lead you to make investments in a certain way. Let me just make that absolutely concrete. So last year there was the chief head of investment for HSBC, a really, really big bank. He was interviewed, he did a talk, and he said, we make investment decisions about what we're going to fund. He says, we have a 6-year cycle where we give out the money, etc. So anything that beyond 6 years, we will ignore from our investments, and we won't include that in investment decisions. Right, so that's what structures their decision about what gets funded. So for as far as HSBC is concerned, climate change does not exist because it takes place on a longer level. So our big thing we decided what we got to include in this is the ability for communities to make their own decisions about investment, about where the social surplus goes. So this is all really, really abstract, and I'll explain that in a moment when we get to a proper case study. So this is like an abstract diagram of how a public-common partnership might be governed. There's a public in there, which might be the local government, or it might be something else. There's what we call a common association, and that is always a democratic body made up of, could have various people feeding into it, but on the base, your general idea would be people from the community would join this commons association, and then they feel to participate in a democratic way. Then the other ones are like, you know, basically there's another set of like what we call experts or stakeholders who have the knowledge that the community doesn't necessarily have to make the good decisions, if you know what I mean. Yes, exactly. The next thing in this sort of abstract, this hopefully will all make sense when we come back to like the actual communities who are doing this. The other thing of this is like, how do you scale these projects? Don't worry about that diagram in the middle yet. But the main idea is this, is that if you have a project, perhaps a pharmaceutical company in France, the surplus, the profits that are made, the surplus that is made from that after the operating costs, after you've serviced all your debts and all of that sort of stuff, that will be transferred to this common association, this democratic body, who will then make a decision about where that's invested and how that's invested. And the idea would be that they would like invest that, or perhaps use that money to set up a new project, a public common partnerships project, which would produce a new surplus, which would then set up a new public common partnership. And that's what this diagram is. Each of those letters is like one of these public common partnerships. And each one of those numbers is like an investment that they're making each year into a different public common partnership to start a new public common partnership. So the idea is that you have it like this thing which starts to, it's like a self-expanding dynamic, we've called it there, where one project can help start a new project. So a nicer way to think about it is this little sprouting diagram here, which is like a little plant, which is like a rhizome. So, you know, you grow one plant and it goes and seeds another plant, and that one seeds another plant, and that's how it grows and grows to become bigger part of the economy. That's the sort of abstract. I think it's going to change in a moment. That's the sort of abstract diagram. And we did start at this abstract level.
It'll just be normal.
Oh yeah. And then, right, you'll never believe this, but these abstract ideas we have, they became very, very different when you've got an actual project and you've got an actual community you're going to have their say in all of this. So I'll talk through a few of those and we'll see how this works out in practice. It becomes a little bit more interesting. The first one I'm going to talk about is this market in London, in Tottenham, in North London. It's called various names. It's quite often known as the Latin Village. And it's called that because this market in a building in North London is a very important part of like the Latin American community in London. It's like one of the hubs of the Latin American community in London. So it sort of became known as the Latin Village. Actually, the site is called Ward's Corner. And so this is some diagrams from what's known as the Ward's Corner Community Plan. And this is one of the things we do in our organization, is to help groups to come up with plans for how either one building or perhaps a neighborhood could be developed on their own according to their own needs, basically, and what they want to do first, these sorts of things. This is in a building in North London, this Ward's Corner. It had a market in it. Then I think it's actually 17 years ago now. Yeah, 17 years ago, there were development plans put forward by a big developer called Granger. And they were going to knock the market down and do a classic development which you'd find in London, which would be build luxury houses and then build a market at the bottom, which would not have small stall holders from all around the world in it, but would have chain stores in it and stuff like that. The market traders, they got organized and they fought this. They built a campaign around it. They fought it for like 12 years. And then in 2007, they decided, look, it's no good just like saying we don't want this. You've got to say what we do want. So they started this process of developing what they call a community plan, democratically developing a community plan for what they want to see on that site. Then, like miraculously, in 2021, the developers Granger finally said, okay, this is not going to work. There's too much opposition. To be honest, I think it was also COVID and the financial situation changed. But they said, all right, we're going to pull out. We're going to pull out of our plans. We don't want to do it anymore. Then you're in a situation of, well, actually, this community plan might well work. You know? And we got invited in to sort of turn it to see if we could develop a public common partnership model around this site, basically. The decision about what's going to happen with that building is going to be taken, I think, at the end of this year, and this is being recorded, in it. I don't know what I can say, but anyway, I'm going to say it. It doesn't matter if I say it. There's no other credible plan for the site, so this really looks like it's going to happen, which is great because their community plan that they've developed and we've helped them develop is really very ambitious because it's not just about that building. The actual building, if you see here, look, there's Ward's Corner on the bottom, and there's a row of like shop fronts, and above that there will be flats as well in this project. it's sort of quite a big site. And so this is like this diagram of like that 3-part diagram I said before, public, commons, association, turns into something very, very complicated. We don't have to go through all of it. But I can put some bits to it. So the public in this is Transport for London. They're the sort of quasi-public because they own the building, and they own that building because it's a tube line runs really close underneath. Their main concern is they don't want anybody messing with that building so it falls through and falls onto the tube line. That's their main interest. The Seven Sisters Market Tenants Association, that's the market traders who've been campaigning for a long, long time. The Commons Association in this, though, is the West Green Road Seven Sisters Development Trust. So that's the local area, basically. That's what this Commons Association is. So this is a joint enterprise. There's a community benefit society set up. They're going to run the whole site, the development of the site. If we can get this to do it, Transport for London will use their existing assets because they own lots of property all around London for very similar reasons, actually, because they've got to protect the tube line. So they can say, well, look, we've got all of these assets. So when they borrow money, or if they help us borrow money, we can reduce the costs hugely. So that's like the public or the quasi-public de-risking, taking the risk away for commoning projects, which make these things much more possible, is our sort of idea. So this is the important bit. After all of these, the debts have been paid off, etc., the debts have been serviced, etc. The financial modelling for this means that the estimate is after 2 years, I should have got these figures down, shouldn't I? After 2 years, £2.3 million will be given to the West Green Road Seven Sisters Development Trust. So that's, you don't have to pay all your debts up at once, but you service your debts, you pay for your operating costs, and then the surplus after all of that, that will go to the West Green Road Seven Sisters Development Trust. So they're then tasked with working out what they want to do with that. And so they're developing a plan for how they would like the area to develop. I think the first sort of idea that they're going to do is set up a community-owned nursery, basically, and then perhaps that will produce a profit, and that will go to develop this plan further, etc. What was I going to say about this? I can't remember now. Yeah, and so basically, this is, you know, this is, you know, it's quite a well-developed project. This, like, you know, there's been, you know, everything's sort of been all been set up. There's been a lot of work, 17 years where you're struggling, etc. Formed a very strong community to start with. But over the last couple of years, we've got some money to go out and do some community organising in order to try to bring people in as members of the West Green Road Seven Sisters Development Trust. And at the moment, I think tomorrow, actually, they're running workshops in Tottenham where people are getting together and they're going to say, you know, what would you do in this local community if you had £1 million? And they're coming up with all different ideas. You know, that's the sort of level it's at now. It's that we haven't got £1 million, but we've got to get people involved. So there's a you know, big democratic participation. I think there's something like 2,000 members so far, but they want to build it up to like 10,000 members, something like that. That gives you an idea of how this abstract model develops into something very concrete and changes quite a lot. I don't know how long I've been talking. I can't remember. Oh, sorry. That just means there's an asset lock on it. So basically, this, once it's in community ownership, it can't be, you know, if the joint enterprise, the governing board, etc., decide they want to turn it, they want to sell it into private hands, it's not possible because it's been locked. I forgot that little bit was on there.
Yeah, it's just sort of 5 minutes mark here, and then we can do.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll just do very quickly then that this can also work in very, very different environments. So I said before, now let's go up to the Isle of Skye, totally different to Tottenham in North London. In Tottenham, well, Tottenham, some not so much, but all of London, obviously, the thing that the really, really big problem is the hugely rising price of property and so forth. Not so true on Skye. In fact, depopulation is a really, really big problem upon Skye, and being able to try and get housing built, etc., particularly on this Isle of Raasay, I was saying, with 300 people, you know. So we got invited into this project, which was actually started by artists, by an artist collective called Cooking Sections. They got nominated for the Turner Prize last year for this project, actually. In fact, for this thing down here, I don't know if you can see that. that's like it's called the oyster table. At high tide, it's an oyster bed, but oysters are growing. At low tide, it's a table where the community can come and cook, or you don't cook oysters. Well, you do cook oysters, but have some food and like discuss. So it's a nice little idea of that, like joined up sort of thing. The whole sort of impetus for this was in some ways it was an anti-salmon farming good thing. Yeah. And so like there is a connection between Tottenham in North London, where you have these developments in which these big firms are going to come in, they're going to build these things, and all of the profits they make, that's going to get out of Tottenham, to be honest, probably out of the country as well. Similar with this, salmon farming is like a big extractive industry. They're actually Norwegian multinationals, weirdly, but all of the money from that will go off to Norway, will not circulate on Sky, and the wages you get paid on salmon farming, they're below the levels at which communities can reproduce themselves. And salmon farming is actually environmentally really deleterious. But that's the reason why salmon is so cheap, is because all of those costs are offloaded onto nature or offloaded onto the community. So this is the idea, is that you're trying to set up aqua farms which are environmentally regenerative. So they basically, so oysters and seaweed and these sorts of things, they actually clean the water as they grow, and they sequestrate carbon as well in order to grow. So you're doing things environmentally, and the point of it is to try to create other income streams which will allow these projects to be socially reparative as well, to repair the communities, because we're communally governing them, but also because people can participate in. So one of the ways in which people would get involved in this is through a community-supported aquaculture scheme. So you have these community-supported agriculture schemes where you get a vegetable box delivered and you pay, and you're trying to help support organic growing, etc. Well, this is, you get your oysters every hold on, I'm not quite sure, and a big lump of seaweed. Do with that what you like. Actually, seaweed growing is a really expanding area of yeah, that's just an example. So I'll really quickly do the pharmaceuticals as Commons project, because it's a very interesting one, because this is a project in France which we got invited into, and it's a network of people who are interested in commoning and these sorts of things, but also a network of pharmaceutical engineers and people who work in the pharmaceutical industry. Basically, they're all unionists, so that's why they were brought together. And one of the spurs for this project was the experience of COVID, actually, and the COVID vaccinations, which are a public-private partnership model. The state paid for the research on those COVID. The private companies, they basically said, right, we own this intellectual property now. And like, I don't think it's a big claim to say like up to 1 million people died, particularly in the global south, because of that, because they wouldn't roll out the vaccines for free, etc., in the global south, and so people weren't getting the vaccines, and so more people died. So the people in the pharmaceutical industry were like, we finally got to do something about the pharmaceutical industry, basically. So this is a project to set up a network of commonly owned pharmaceutical factories who are producing pharmaceuticals. At first, it will have to be out of patent pharmaceuticals, so ones which haven't got intellectual property around them, just because of the economics are so huge in this sort of industry. But the idea would, part of the surplus for that would be going to develop our own research capacities, basically, until you can get to a level where perhaps you could do the research on the vaccines. I mean, that's a bit of a long way off, but that's because the sums are just astronomical. but what we also thought about that is this is a very different sort of setup to an urban development an urban development project. The community involved is pretty obvious. It's the people who live in that area. They're going to have the knowledge that you need to make very good decisions about what they want in that area. Not quite the same in this, because the workers obviously have the knowledge about the production process, etc. But the people who are impacted by the operations of this are patients who will be stretching probably around the world. Like, that's very hard to. So one of the things we did in this was to think, if you produce pharmaceuticals in a very different way, you have very different incentives. The perverse incentives for like the pharmaceutical industry is they want to produce medicines, and they want that as many people to take as much of that medicine as possible, because that's where you get your profits. And of course, actually with medical interventions, you probably want to get to a situation where you're trying to reduce the market for your products. And so in this some of the profits from the pharmaceutical sector, they will go to what's called a common health association, and that will be a territorially based community in the area upon which the factory is based. And they'd be given that money perhaps to make sort of health interventions in that area, perhaps addressing some like the environmental provocations of illness, but depending on what the illness is. But one of the drugs being thought of for one of the proposed factories is around diabetes, etc. And diabetes have this, or type 2 diabetes has this big environment. You could be doing things such as like traffic calming measures, perhaps community supported agriculture schemes, etc., in order to try to address health in a much more holistic manner. Which is just an example of when you start to take these sort of economic processes out of that sort of private profit, maximize private profit to the absolute extreme logic. Once you take it out of that, a whole new way of like approaching the world becomes possible, I think, which is illustrated by this like more holistic approach to health. Okay, let's leave it there. There is one more about Bradford, but we can talk about that another time.
So it'd be really nice to think that something we can run over because we've had some tech sort of trouble, but like let's kind of still say we'll be kind of do 10 minutes for a bit of a discussion between the two of you and any questions, and then we'll be done by 5 past, I think. But yeah, thanks loads, Keir, because I mean again I just think well both Sue and Keir, you know, it's nice to have that kind of grounding in the local and what's actually happened here, and then sort of moving through into and you know what's the kind of concrete possibilities as well, and the kind of and the necessary stuff. So it might be nice to sort of explore that a little bit more. Just for people at home, are we all right just sort of sat where we are? People can sort of see Sue and hear what she's saying, or do we need to rearrange yourself?
People can see Sue. I'm conscious that maybe Andy, if you could move to this seat though, that be a little bit closer to the mic, just in case.
So Mike.
Right, okay, well I'll give a bit of room to Sue then. So that's good, yeah.
Thank you.
Sat there, completely, but yeah, I mean, I suppose what is kind of the starting point for me, and I mean, it'd be nice to kind of get some questions from other people, but would be what would the practical application of these things, the updating of the kind of the Clarion House and the you know the history and the heritage of kind of cooperative action in the place look like through this lens of the kind of public commons partnerships, because there's kind of certain things there that can be activated, isn't there, like things that you need, and the kind of people power and the history is here, isn't it? I don't know, how do you feel about it?
We've already done similar. Both buildings have had projects in them, which have we did a film and republished the book, but updated it for the Clarion House. We got a Heritage Lottery grant for that. That's coming from the public, isn't it?
Yes,
and that was done because the woman who did the filming and involved with making a film about the Women's Peace Crusade, which took place in 1917. And the last scene was going to be in Victoria Park, but there's a motorway goes through it now. So we took a bit of artistic license and did the last scene up at the Clarion. And she said, "Oh, what's this?" And because she never seen it before, she said, "We should do something." So that's what led on to the film. But we've had a lot of visitors come to the area specifically because they've seen the film, and obviously it's in Portillo film.
Yes,
but they a lot of people come on purpose to visit the area because they've seen this publicity. The one at Unity Hall, we got a Heritage Lottery grant for that, and a lot of the displays in there are all about local history and what's happened locally. And we hope that will be open much more to the public soon when the cafe gets up and running again. So those two things have both been funded by public donations from the Heritage Lottery through local people putting in bids and hoping that something comes of it, and it happens.
And they kind of produce like an actual, like a book, you say, that which then could be sold, which could then go into feed something.
Didn't even sell it. We produced it through the costs of what we got, and I took them to all the libraries in Lancashire and distributed them to people, and just gave them away. And then they did the same down at Interdisciplinary. They've got booklets about that too, but a bit restricted because the cafe wasn't open because of the pandemic. Like that, so.
Sue, how was Clarion House funded originally? Was it like member subscription?
And that was a loan from the Weavers Union,
Ah, yeah.
£350, and then obviously it's been run ever since by volunteers. So it's all been public in a roundabout way. The only money we make is through selling cups of tea on a Sunday,
Yeah.
and that's how we fund it. But we do get donations from people, but it is publicly funded, so we don't get any money from anywhere.
Is there a membership though?
We're run as a cooperative,
Yeah.
and but we tend to be a bit precious about who got shares, so we've got to be committed socially to the project. But we do have a very thriving friends group, and the people can be members of that. So that's through £3 a year sort of thing. So we've got a big friends group. We do little improvement projects and stuff like that. So it's all publicly funded, really. So we try to run it on the principles that we believe in, which is collective and
Yeah, and I mean, but yeah, I suppose the kind of to again, so the bit that it's making me think about is, well, where are the moments where there could be this thing that almost becomes the kind of self-regenerating things. Actually, well, me and Keir were talking about on the way here.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of kind of community and cooperative initiatives that are really important have all been based on the idea of people having spare time, which is now becoming less and less a thing. So the kind of what Keir's bringing in, or is okay, well, actually, there are these things that could produce either the profit or the surplus that gets fed back in. I'm just wondering, well, where does that exist? Well, I mean, one of the resources that you just mentioned there that I guess Pendle has, which we've not spoken about so much in these sessions, is that idea of the natural resources, and the kind of like and the tourism that,
which is what the
that
Landscape Partnership was trying to promote in all sorts of different ways, and that has also generated a lot of interest. But once again, that's come from the public first, again from people buying lottery tickets. But I mean, but it's employed a lot of people. A lot of graduates have been employed. A lot of people have come in and been project managers for different projects. Been new graduates have come in and they've got experience and they've moved on to different. So it does create employment in that way, but on a wider scale, it's getting into the heads of people who make the decisions locally. That's the problem, I think. The people who I get fed up with all these businesses get drawn in. People who run a business come in and make decisions. Very often they're making decisions based on what they see as what's going to regenerate their business, and that's private. So what this idea of involving people and it being public is a fantastic idea. It's getting into the heads of the people who make the decisions in the first place and convincing them that that's the way to do it. Because a lot of them have got self-interest. A lot of those people are on these partnerships. They get public, like you said, the public-private initiative. And incidentally, too, a lot of schools in this area wouldn't have been built without that. So I know the principle's wrong, but there were 2 high schools in Colne now that would never have, and Nelson, that would never have been built if it hadn't been for that. But the way it was structured was completely wrong. But it was to keep it out of the public sector borrowing. Exactly. You know, it's a bit like social housing. The only reason we don't have council housing anymore because they moved the budget out of the public sector into a housing association, so it didn't get figured, but it's still public money. This whole thing's madness. But I mean, it's getting it into the heads of the people who make the decision. That's the problem.
And how does that bit work here? Because I mean, that's kind of, again, it's like good to be able to have the concrete examples. How's the buy-in from the kind of local authority or kind of even the developer to kind of say, oh, we're going to give up now? How do you get those people to give up control?
Yeah, I mean, well, part of the reason we started with this project, or one of the attractions of this project was that it could start from various places, from the various bits of the partnership, right? You know what I mean? So we sort of think about it as like an inside out or an outside in strategy. There's one way to do this. You can get somebody who, somebody in a local council who's quite into these ideas, and I can't actually talk about the pharmaceutical thing because it's a little bit case sensitive. But that one of the sites of which we're looking where a factory might be built quite soon is where the mayor of a place I can't say is basically quite into these ideas,
Yeah,
and he's looking for a different way in which the pharmaceutical production can
Yeah.
take place, because it's a big industry, a traditional industry in his area. And it may be that he's going to negotiate with a very big company and get and make them build us a factory.
yeah, as long as you get them to stick to that principle,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
the thing,
yeah. But like, but that's in France, and in the UK it's a little bit more difficult. And you know, we've got you know, there are elements where people are interested, but you know, before you get to that stage, you have to do the proof of concept thing, which is what we're still in with this. So one of the ways you can start is you can start on the outside and then invite a local authority in, which is basically how the Ward's Corner community plan.
Well, I know I've read a lot about that, and there was a big uproar about it. The council were going to go along with the whole project, weren't they? And there was a public uproar about it, and it made them step back and think, and then the time lapse made the developer pull out.
Yeah.
But I've read about that.
Yeah, I mean, so the council is on board with the
They're on
community
board
plan
now,
now. Yeah,
there was a lot of lobby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, that's gone on for 17 years. So
No.
a lot of councils have come and gone in that. That's
really,
But so that's one of the other ways you can do it, is you can start one of these projects off and get a long way actually, and say, well, look, this is a credible. You can build your credibility up over a longer sort of period, and invite the local council in that sort of sense.
So the more examples you can give, and the more people can talk and think, oh, that sounds like it. Shall we? Well, Albert, let's try it. You know,
I mean, the other thing to think about is the other part is like, well, where does the community come from, or the start of the community come from, and that is quite different as well. There are different cases. So in this Ward's Corner community, there's in some ways like there's a campaign, there's like a political campaign to stop a development, and it almost becomes natural if that goes on for a long time to say, well, what do you want instead? So there's a project we're working on in Hume where it's not quite the same, but basically there's a development in a big area of social housing. Actually, it's a purpose-built student accommodation, which is really flying up everywhere because the standards can be lower. And so this is a campaign to defeat. And then that's why you have these student accommodations. I live in Leeds, they're absolutely all over the place. They won't stay student accommodation, most of them. They'll be swapped over, but the standards can still remain low. So basically there's a big campaign we've been doing for a while to stop that. They're called Block the Block, this campaign. Very interesting campaign. And they've got to this stage now where saying, well, it's not enough, is it, to say we don't want this because there's an empty site here, more or less derelict site. So you have to come up with an idea of what else could go there. The way you could do that, you know, they're the core of a community group, basically, around which, you know, you can say, well, let's go through this process of develop a community plan. Other projects are not like that. You know, you start from somewhere else. The project in the Isle of Skye that we're talking with, like that's an idea that's been introduced into Skye in some sort of way. But the core of that are these development trusts that do exist. But they'd exist in very, very different circumstances. On the Isle of Raasay, I was talking about this island with 300 people, very well organised. They already have community-owned power, a community-owned shop. They're doing some community-owned build housing at the moment. Really, really active. We talked to some other development trusts, and they're like, oh, we're the same 5 people who also do this and we do that. And it's like, so some of it you have to work out how you help develop a community to get to a stage where they can even start to do these sorts of things. So that's the other problem is, you know, where does the community start?
I think listening to both Keir and Sue and what they had to say, it seems to me that the greater the democratic deficit, and we have a democratic deficit, the best way to get something to happen is to be the awkward squad and simply get in the way of something else until they stop shouting at you and start listening to you. Otherwise, they'll just do what they want and you'll be left with the consequences of that.
I mean, the other way to talk about that, if there's a democratic deficit, and there absolutely is, right? Well, how do you address that? Well, one way is we'll form our own democratic organisations, and we will own assets, and we will go and negotiate with the council and work with the council. But all of a sudden, because we own assets, we're in the same sort of power position as the developers are, and the relationship will flip.
Are you familiar with Taiwan?
No, what?
Okay. So it's a consensus, it's based on a platform called Polis, which is about consensus building. There's
Could you say the name again?
the Taiwan. The website, and you can look now, Keir, it's extraordinary. But the thing is that the Polis, which is, I think, one of the platforms that it's built on, visualizes opinion. And what happens when people see opinion is they gradually get to a consensus, which is then the instruction to Parliament for the new legislation. And I think it's quite extraordinary. But recently I thought, yeah, actually, let's just do this in Nelson, forget the rest of the country. So that things like what you're talking about getting, addressing the democratic deficit and creating leverage for people. With the amount of money that we spend on our gas and electricity in my street or the Leeds Road, when you scale that up to Nelson, let alone the council need the traffic lights on at 3 o'clock and all that complete nonsense, which is just, I don't know, £1 million saved a year just at the flick of the switch. Leaving all that aside, if you got even 10% of the power, you would have millions of pounds to leverage for Dutch auctions with power companies. And the reason I find myself getting excited about this is because, when we talk about community, we tend to look backwards. Now, whereas absolutely the lens of the past gives the future, but we're not going to be able to reverse engineer that, because what we've got now is what we've got. Our community is the conversation that Harry set up for us on Eve actually was about, maybe community is the wrong word because it has all these pictures of all this massive, very particular way of joining together. That we don't have that now. Now we've got Facebook, WhatsApp. We are joining ways. Surely we need to begin to think about that. That's why politics is so interesting, because it really does produce the things you've been talking about so eloquently, and they are so important. But it needs to happen, because part of the democratic deficit I discover, being a newcomer to the town, is that nobody I've spoken to can get any of the councillors to come to their meetings. And I spent 40 minutes doing a consultative thing online, only to discover they'd already made the decision. I mean, I'm in a serious what's going on. So anything, let's get policy going. Let's.
So that's like a digital tool, sorry, to be able to kind of visualize the. Okay, so sorry, because Sue's having to actually.
Thank you for playing.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Lovely. Thank you. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah.
And I think, yeah, we'll aim to kind of just get wrapped up, just so it's got a sort of neat ending at the moment. Can you see what the question online is? Yes, we're going to have to hope that it's for Keir.
Where participatory budgeting in Brazil was so was an interesting process of democratic decision making on spending. Oh yeah, sorry, the question here, sorry. Could Keir expand on how these public commons partnerships are structured legally incorporated to be able to pass forward surplus? Thank you. And that's Sam Bonner being one of our research artists.
Yeah, I talked to Sam actually. So let's go back to so for the Wards Corner community Wards Corner community plan, the joint I'm just doing it on this and it's not nice. It's fine, it's fine. So the joint enterprise is a community benefits a society basically. And so the West Green Road Seven Sisters Trust, the Development Trust, they set up the Community Benefit Society. So one of the things we can do with the Community Benefit Society is that you can the way we like to think of it is the joint enterprise bit where the different people are feeding in and you run the enterprise, etc. That's an area where you have to negotiate different interests, right? And so like the Transport for London, their main interest is to not have this building work done so it collapses. So we can give them a particular, with the community benefit societies, which Sam will know all about. You can have different sort of membership types, basically, which have different rights and responsibilities. And so you can give TfL basically a veto over any infrastructural work on that building which might interfere with. They can say no to that. Perhaps the market traders, like one of the things that they wanted when we were doing research on them was that like they'd had loads of problems with the market managers. They wanted to appoint the market managers, basically. And you know that so you can give certain people different rights, etc. And that's the Community Benefit Society. But we like to think of like the Development Trust or the Commons Association in some way that's sort of like protected from the sort of disciplining effects of finance and borrowing, because the servicing of the debts has been done by the joint enterprise. By the time the money goes to the Commons Association, it's sort of like insulated from those pressures. Do you know what I mean? If you don't want the same sorts of developments as you would get by a private developer, you have to have different sorts of things driving that. But if it's not, if those people in making those decisions about where we're going to invest this surplus, you know, they're not thinking about how do we create the most return, how do we push asset prices up. That's not their concern, basically. They have to have, like, that's a space in which people decide, well, what do we want? You know, it's a different model of like, what are our priorities in this community? It's like a different form of like valuing things, basically. What do we want to happen and what do we want to happen first? They're going to have to discuss that, debate it, and come up with a plan, you know. But basically, that is sort of like insulated from. It's not the place where different interests with different different people with different interests negotiate. It's people who are like, you know, just all on the same level, basically, trying to work out what they want to do with that surplus. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, Keir. I think so. Sam's just put in another comment as well that says, Port Alegre participated with budgeting in Brazil was an interesting process of democratic decision making on spending. Yeah,
it's a really interesting thing, because in some ways that is what you're doing. You're doing participatory budgeting of the investment of the surplus. And just to come to your point about that platform, one of the organizations that we've been working with is an organization called Hydra, which is a similar sort of organization in Barcelona, and they do a lot of like policy development and like work around that for Barcelona in Common, which is like it's sort of like a citizens platform, basically, where the citizens have got together. They crowdsource their policies via this online decision-making platform, which I now can't remember the name of. So it's not a great answer. Yeah, and it works on a really, really large scale, and they mix that with like basically neighborhood assemblies where they meet together. Slightly easier, as we were saying, because in Barcelona you can meet outside. Having street parties in the UK is slightly more weather dependent, but like there's huge possibilities on that of like really lowering the cost of participation, because you know you've got these platforms in which you can make decisions and come to decisions, etc. So we're not at that stage where we've gone through that. With our project, we're always pushing against the limits of what we know how to do, and then we'll sort of like push it a little bit further. And so things such as like the participative budgeting, you know, that and how that could interrelate with like a sort of tech platform which can help facilitate decisions, etc. So that's work to do basically as we reach the next stage of some of these projects.
But which is a great thing to leave us with, Keir, because we wanted some kind of like prompt or provocation actually for sort of like things to work with. So I think this idea of kind of how we sort of map what the assets are, but also think about what the tools are to kind of to build that capacity would be really useful to take forward. So I'm going to suggest that we finish now, just because you know people need to get off at we're running 15 minutes late, but there's loads for us to continue to talk about. Big round of applause again here. Getting on a barrow applause. So the next thing that we've got in here is on the weekend, on Saturday and Sunday, there's the artist research sharing. I would make a special mention about Sam's workshop, which is at 11 in Nelson Library, which is looking at this idea of alternative economies and alternative town planning. I think that's a really nice sort of follow up to this session, and we'll keep that fresh in our minds. And then there's going to be a display of the research that you can come and have a look at as well. We'll have another talk at sort of 6 p.m. What's the best way for people to find out on the this is no
Sunday
Well, just on Saturday and Sunday.
Yeah, there's all on our socials.
In-Situ, social page.
Or
Is
an
there
email
anything
from
that
Callum.
isn't, is there like a, this is Nelson website?
There is a section now on the In-Situ website,
Okay, cool.
but are you on our mailing list, Joe?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I get that, but,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you'll see
Yeah.
all that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd like this weekend of activities, obviously a great follow-up to tonight is Sam's mapping session, an alternative town plan. And that will be on, yeah, like 11 o'clock on Saturday.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for coming as well. Thanks again to Shabazz for the biggest business.
We.